they have a tendency to yank the sun's equator around faster than its polar spin. The difference is key because the polar spin is 37 in some fractional part number of days, and the equatorial spin is 25 in some fractional part number of days. And the fractional parts are important. They're, in fact, the key to the whole understanding of what Gerald found and what Maurice Cottrell found within the various Mayan and Egyptian encodings.
So just to help people out, if someone were standing at the very top, the North Pole, for example, they would rotate, their body would spin at...
Once every 37 days, they would do a complete loop.
And if they were standing at the equator?
They'd whip around once every 25 in some fractional part
Okay,
days.
just wanted to get that mental image. All right.
Yeah, so they're whipping around a little faster than the at the equator. And you can think of it this way: if you put a 2 or 3 pound weight, even a 1 pound weight on an end of a string that's somewhat long, and you started spinning and you let that string out, the more the string you let out, the faster the string will appear to be accelerating around in the arc ahead of you. So it'll actually seem to tug on you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same kind of effect that's going on here. And basically what happens is that over a course of this whole process, by the way, accounts for sunspots, why we don't have sunspots sometimes, why there's an 11-year cycle involved in the sunspot activity. It accounts for the periodic sun flips of its poles, as well as the shock that comes out later and hits the rest of the planets. And it's all internal to the solar system. And it may be that every solar system works this way, and Gerald may have indeed stumbled on a basic rule of how solar systems work, and they may have to work this way. I stumbled on Gerald's work because I was starting to write a book about taking the transition from a class 0 or type 0 society to a type 1. And I had a fundamental question as to why we had not achieved that yet. And I started looking at some other periodic stuff and was led to Gerald's work. In any event, though, the idea is that as the sun spins around faster at the equator, it will spin around and lap. The equator will lap the pole every 87 days, and some fractional part thereof. Mm-hmm. And as it goes around and laps the pole, it pulls on the magnetic windings, if you will, of the sun itself, bearing in mind that the sun is a giant electromagnetic thingy sitting up there, arcing off so much that it gives us light and heat, X-rays, and all other kinds of energy. And when it's getting its magnetic limbs tugged, that's what actually ends up causing the sunspots.
So we could say we've got strings, as it were, coming out of the equator headed north, and another set of strings headed out of the equator to the south pole.
No. They're
How does it
north
work?
And they go to the south, and just like the magnetic lines out of the top of a magnet going to the south pole of the magnet. And they're undisturbed. If the sun just sat there and none of the planets moved, they would just be totally vertical, connecting the north and south pole.
So one total loop from the top to the bottom, all the way
Correct.
around.
And actually it even goes internal into the back through the middle of the sun to come out the other side, so to speak. So
I was thinking of a sideways toroidal donut kind of a thing, but
yeah,
that's
no.
not
It ends up looking like that in the end, but it doesn't really start out that way, and nothing ever comes out of the equator. What happens is that the stresses, the gravitational forces, actually are so intense at the sun's equator due to this extra spin, the pull of all the planets yanking on the equator there, that it distorts magnetism itself.
Uh-huh.
And so it bends the magnetic arms in the direction of the rotation. And so these arms very much start to form almost a 90-degree bend in them as they're pulled at the equator, and because they emerge out of the top of the sun in the North Pole, and then want to head naturally down to the South Pole, only they can get only so far into the equatorial plane, and the tug of the planets pulls them and distorts them. And the same thing is true from the south attempting to get up to the north. And so either way, you're looking at just a mirror image. In any event, though...
So you like to call these windings.
Correct, yeah.
Right.
And basically it's kind of like trying to, put a tack in the top of a croquet ball and tie some yarn to it, and then you start winding the yarn around the croquet ball, and it's going to be very much the same effect.
Huh. Okay, that's a good image. Forget that. Windings. Think of that. Yarn, croquet ball, tack in the top, and then wind the yarn around the sphere of the croquet ball, which would be the sun. The distortions included, of course. So over time, it would seem to me, and I think we're going to get there, that these windings become rather constrictive on the overall ability of the sun to flex itself, so to speak.
Yeah.
But we'll find out more from Clif in just a few. Hang on. All right, if you can, take the link in guests and go to halfpasthuman.com and look at the special material for tonight. You can see drawn very nice graphics of exactly what Clif is explaining, how the magnetic fields come out of the top and go to the bottom and vice versa, and how as this big machine, this big generator spins, especially at the equator, how it distorts these magnetic waves of flux, and they're called windings in the Clif High vernacular, and it works very well. Okay, go ahead, Clif.
Well, basically, you're correct with our little croquet ball kind of image. Ultimately, you get too many windings in too little space, and even though they're magnetic and not actually physical filaments, the distortion levels build and do not dissipate simply because the planets continue to go around. Now, the beauty of all of this is that the Mayans knew this precisely. This is why the long count was done in days. That's why days matter. For instance, our calendar, we usually like to think in terms of weeks or perhaps months, and these are administrative kind of decisions that are made in their administrative divisions that are really rather artificial. The Mayans, on the other hand, and the Egyptians had day calendars that were very specific about this. Well, the reason it turns out that we can be specific about it is because the math is so precise that given the current state of the orbit as measured by the precession of the equinox, we can actually determine from period to period when these windings will get to be too much and go into what we can think of as an expansion phase. Basically what happens is the internal generator magnetism gets really twisted up all the way from the poles down to the equator, and we start getting very chaotic forms of sunspots instead of, quote, regular sorts of sunspots. A regular sunspot can be defined as one that will appear and then stick around on the sun and go for between 25 to 30 days, usually no less than 2 weeks as it travels around the backside and may appear on the other side of the sun. And this is a coincident feature of the internal tetrahedron hyperdimensional nature of the sun in all spheres in space, in coincident with the magnetic arm crawling up its face. Now we're into a phase where predictably, the magnetic arms are not only wrapped up in windings, but they're starting to twist in on themselves. And eventually what happens is the whole thing gets so twisted up and there's so much bottled up magnetic energy, it becomes very much like a pressurized magnetic containment vessel, and something has to give, basically.
Wow, okay, I got it. So the windings literally cover the surface of the sun, to keep this real simplistic. And
if we could see them indeed.
If
yes.
we could.
Yeah.
They bind it, it completely encapsulated it,
and
basically.
Pressurize it. They've
and
caused
pressurized
the change
it.
in the color.
Exactly.
They've caused the increase in the intensity of the sun over these past few years. They've led to the situation where even NASA's astroevolutionists are saying, we don't know what's going on. This is a weird cycle. We should be into solar cycle 24, yet here we are in the weakest one ever. Are we going to go into another Maunder minimum or something like that? They just don't know what's going on.
Well, they're listening to tonight.
Well, I doubt that. I don't think they care about this kind of stuff.
This program is going to be listened to by a lot of people. Go ahead.
Okay, so basically what's going on, though, is that we can think of this in extremely simplistic ways, of course. I mean, the graphics that we put up there are just illustrations just to give you the concept, because the level of complexity is beyond our ability to picture. And if we threw in all of the magnetic windings and all of their strange, chaoticness, it would look very much like Medusa's hair kind of a thing, all these writhing magnetic snakes going everywhere. In any event, so they get to the point where there is a predictable lack of sunspots. And it's predictable because we won't have these magnetic arms being able to climb up past a certain degree of latitude on the sun, and that's where sunspots occur. And they won't be able to climb up because there's too many of these windings that are jam-packed from that degree of latitude and forcing it down towards the equator. When this happens, and you get into this lack of sunspot age, and the chaotic sunspots, that is to say, some that will just come up and then disappear in a matter of hours, or some that will come up and just be the most violent things ever, persist for a day or two, and then fade away inexplicably. When this occurs predictably, that's when we're getting close to the maximum level of these windings, because the windings are now reaching into the equator. And at some point, they'll get to the point where it just can't take anymore, and a magnetic sphere will be created. They'll expand out basically like a giant EMP, or a giant magnetic a wave or explosion coming out of the sun. It may even be so magnetically intense that it'll be perceivable if you happen to be looking in the direction of the sun when it occurs, because it would just make that much of an impact on your retina that it would trigger it as though it had been firing off on photons.
And what speed will that emit from the sun itself? How long do we have to duck?
Well, there's the thing. Light takes 8.5 minutes from the sun. This can be presumed to be close to the speed of light, because the level of pressure that's going on is actually starting to distort light. So it wouldn't surprise me if it took 7 minutes or something along those lines, and just slightly superluminal, slightly faster than the speed of light. And the magnetic bow wave, if we could see it coming, ought to be rather spectacular. It ought to cause the constant state of aura, or rather aurora borealis, the northern lights, around the whole globe simultaneously.
Big show, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be frying satellites and pushing, anything at remotely magnetic into the atmosphere if it's between us and the sun. So it ought to be quite spectacular. And it would account for all of the strange effects and all of the legends and all the prophecies about, the really bizarre things that our sun is capable of doing.
Okay, let me back up just a bit. Hold that thought, please. We'll go back to the windings. They're so tight, they're so chaotic, they have just crushed that sphere basically with this energy, and the sun can't breathe. So it's going to throw all this off in a big, not a CME, but, well, I guess...
CME might be sucked along behind it.
Got it.
Yeah,
that would be secondary. So it's going to throw all this huge magnetic flux out, not necessarily in a uniform 360-degree, fully spherical emission. It could go...
Correct, and the intensity will vary widely depending on how it happens to stuff it, in which direction, and what kind of pressure is behind it.
So the question is the Earth going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Exactly.